Hey everyone, so today we're going to continue talking about the characteristics of life. We left off talking about how living things respond to their environment. Today we're going to be talking about how they grow, reproduce, and then the heredity of traits. So these three things kind of go hand in hand with one another, but today we're going to really break them down so you can see about how each of them is a unique characteristic to living things. Okay, so the first ones we're going to talk about are growth and development. Right, so just growth by itself really isn't unique to living things. If you think about like a snowball rolling down a hill, as it accumulates more snow, it's going to grow and get bigger. So not really unique to living things, but when you have that development piece attached to growth, right, that's when it does become unique to living things. So we see here, right, if we had a seed, if that seed was just getting bigger, that really doesn't happen, right? So our seed here, as it's growing, it's developing or changing, right? So we see your root system starting to develop, stems, maybe some leaves, right? So it's starting to get larger, but it's also changing. So think about yourself as a living organism too. That's happened, right? You started off as just a tiny ball of cells. Then you turned into a baby. As a baby, right, you continue to grow, develop into what you look like today, and you're going to continue growing, and your brain is going to continue developing and changing. And even after this point, right, once you become an adult, you still continue to grow and change. There's a whole field and subcategory of biology called epigenetics, which talks about how the environment has an impact on expression, which is basically just your body developing, right? How your genes are expressing those traits that you have. Anyway, then we'll move on to reproduction, right? So there's two types of reproduction, sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. So asexual reproduction is going to be like your binary fission, right? So done mostly by prokaryotes, where we go from just one parent. That one parent is going to go ahead and make a copy of itself. So it's going to end up in a result of two exact cells, right? So identical copies of each other. In sexual reproduction, you're going to have two parents that combine their genetic information to produce an offspring that's genetically different, right? So that genetically different organism is going to be really important for driving evolution, right? If you're just making copies of yourself, like in asexual reproduction, you're probably not going to be evolving too much. You might be lucky and get a mutation, but overall you're not going to be evolving, and if a disease comes along, it's going to wipe out your entire species, right? So sexual reproduction is going to be really important in our next talk about heredity and evolution. Alrighty, so here it is, evolution, right? So not almost every single organism we know that is classified as living has the hereditary material of DNA, right? So it is possible, they think that RNA was once used as genetic material, but obviously it probably wasn't very efficient because all of the life as we know it today uses DNA as its hereditary material, besides viruses over here, right? But as we know, scientists still do not classify viruses as living things, so we don't need to worry about that. All we need to know is that DNA is the hereditary material that gets passed on, right? And sexual reproduction is what is driving that new genetic material and evolution to occur. Okay, so what we're going to discuss now is just one mechanism of evolution, right? So when you're looking at this diagram, right, in our first picture we see two different types of, well, not two different types, but a bacteria, right, with some different traits. So you have these normal bacteria or resistant antibiotic bacteria. So when those bacteria are exposed to antibiotics, right, the normal bacteria we see is dying off. The antibiotic-resistant bacteria will continue surviving, right? They're going to carry out their characteristics. They'll grow and develop, and eventually go on to reproduce. So here we see them continuing to reproduce, populations getting bigger. The normal bacteria trait is dying off. right? Eventually, all we have left is the antibiotic resistant. So what we say happened was that the antibiotic resistant bacteria was selected for, right? Whereas the normal bacteria was selected against. So it is a good adaptation, or it's an adaptation. Adaptations are beneficial to be antibiotic resistant. Whereas the maladaptation was to be a normal bacterium. Okay, so this is just one mechanism of evolution. It's called natural selection, so hopefully you remember that from your freshman year. Once we get to that unit, we'll discuss a couple more mechanisms for evolution, but this is known as microevolution, right? So just very small changes in a population. Right, so what we're going to move on to next, right, is after these small changes continue to arise, right, after millions and millions of years, we call it macroevolution, is when those small changes, there's enough of them to create a new species. Right, and this macroevolution has kind of driven or organized how we think of species. Right, so here you can see, right, we have our common ancestor. Right, and as you follow the blue line, we have these three major groups: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Right, so these are known as domains. You probably remember us discussing the two types of cells, eukaryotic and prokaryotic. So our eukaryotic fall in this eukarya group. Our prokaryotes are going to split up into two different domains. Right, so depending on their attributes, they'll either fall in the bacteria or archaea group. So both of these groups still aren't completely organized enough to be broken down even smaller into different kingdoms. So we don't really need to worry about these two too much. Just know the different domains and their prokaryotes. And we'll go over some other details in a minute. But the eukarya, you do want to be able to break down the different kingdoms that are organized, right? So the protists, plants, fungi, and animals. Okay, so what do these names mean, right? So it's our classification system. You have domain is the most general group, right? You're either eukaryotic, archaea, or bacteria. Right? And then as we break these groups down into smaller and smaller to get more specific as we go down, there's domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, right? So it's how we characterize living things. So if we're going to do ourselves, right, our whole naming system: Eukarya, Animalia, Chordata, Mammalia, Primates, Hominidae, Homo, and Sapien. Right, but that's kind of a mouthful. So how we name our organisms is just by saying the genus species name. Okay, so it's also going to be important, and you need to know how to write the genus species name properly. Right, so how do we do this? The genus name will always come first. So you should always have genus and then the species name. Genus is capitalized. Species is always lowercase. And then you're also, genus and species must be underlined or italicized. Sorry, this is kind of freaking out right now. Okay, so you always want to follow these three rules when writing the genus species name for any single organism. Alrighty, another thing you want to make sure you know these in the correct order. Right, so you can create whatever mnemonic device you'd like. The one I know is dumb King Philip came over for green spaghetti. So it's kind of silly, but whatever helps you remember, right? Domain is the largest, species is the most specific. So a species means that you can interbreed with organisms that have very similar characteristics to yourself. Okay, so we're going to dive now into these three domains. Let's start off with our prokaryotes and domain archaea. So the domain archaea, they're going to live in very extreme environments. They're also interesting in that they can chemosynthesize their own food. So what this means is they actually break down chemicals to create their own energy. Like we said before, they're prokaryotes. What makes them very different from bacteria is that they actually have very different cell walls. So they're going to lack this peptidoglycan. Alright, and here's our domain bacteria. These are kind of like your general bacteria, the bacteria we always think of, right? They're adapted to all different kinds of environments. They're the bacteria that make us sick. Right here, just a couple of examples that you probably know a few of already. Streptococcus, Staphylococcus. Right, so they can absorb, photosynthesize, or chemosynthesize their food. So, a very large group. Alrighty, and then finally we get to our eukarya group. So there's going to be 4 types of eukaryotic kingdoms. Okay, so you need to know each of these different kingdoms and their characteristics. Right, so you have protists, fungi, plants, and animals. Right, so we're going to start off with our fungus group. So fungus are always heterotrophic. So this means that they make they can make their own food, or they're consumers. Sorry, they're heterotrophic. They can't make their own food. Right, they're consumers. They can be unicellular or multicellular. Most of the time they're multicellular, like this guy, which is a mushroom. Right, except for the one we've worked with a lot in biology, which is yeast. So yeast is a fungus. And their cell wall is made up of chitin. Alright, so next we have plants. So our plants are autotrophic. They do make their own food. Alrighty, so fungus, heterotrophic. They do not make their own food. They're consumers. Plants will make their own food. They are autotrophic. Plants are also multicellular, and their cell wall is going to be made up of cellulose. So it's going to be very specific to the plant kingdom. All right, and then finally we have animals or animalia, which is our kingdom. Right, so you're going to be heterotrophic, multicellular, and no cell wall at all. Alrighty, and then finally our last kingdom is the protists. So protists are eukaryotes, but they don't really fit with anything in particular. It's kind of the dumping ground, right? So anything or any organism that's a eukaryote that doesn't quite fit into our fungi group, plant or animalia group, gets thrown into this protist group. So let's say you are unicellular autotrophic with cellulose. Right, you don't fit into fungus, plants, or animals, so you're considered a protist. Right, so you are not going to be responsible for knowing different organisms that are in that protist group. Scientists are still kind of developing and breaking down that even further. So just like our archaea and bacteria, where scientists are still working on it, protists is the same thing. So there's even been talk of splitting the protist kingdom into multiple kingdoms. That way it could be a little bit more accurate. So science is always changing, so things to keep in mind, but you will be held responsible for knowing the 4 kingdoms, right, and the characteristics of life we've gone over.